This episode of Wheat Pete's Word is brought to you by Syngenta. Stack the deck in your favor in 2025 with a stacked cereals lineup of crop protection products from Syngenta. With proven technology for exceptional disease control and greater plant resilience, you'll find game-changing solutions for your wheat crop. Visit syngenta.ca for more info.
Good day and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, January the 22nd. On this episode of the Word, too funny and too cool. Some neat stuff that's happened to me over the last week. And it is cold. Hey, we have the yields for corn and soybeans here in Ontario. Some really neat stuff about yield monitors to talk about and how that impacts plots. Then we've got pea fertility, weed information, and agronomy updates. Just so much to get through. Let's go! Yes, too funny. I coach kids curling on Sunday afternoons. I was there and I had, I don't know, they were the 7 and 8 year olds, something like that, just having a blast with them. And little Emily down in the hack looks up at me as I'm trying to help her, get set up to curl. And she says, "How long have you been curling?" And I said, "I don't know, it's quite a while, more than 10 years for sure." And she looked at me and she said, "Longer than I've been alive." Oh my gosh, just made me roar. Perspective, people, perspective. Yes, 10 years longer than I've been alive. I love it. And at the Midwest Ag Conference at Rim Park in Waterloo on Friday, my good friend Doug comes up to me and he says, "Hey, Peter, so my son is at the University of Guelph. And you know what they do? A whole group of students get together over a beer and they listen to Wheat Pete's Word and then they talk about whether or not they like what you've said or if they agree or if they have other thoughts." And I'm just going like, wow, Doug, that is so amazing. Number one, if the students get together, they're building their community. Number two, if they're listening to something that's agriculture, agronomy related, and they're talking about it, that means they're using their critical thinking skills. It does not get better than that. So that is just very, very cool. Hey, just before I get into the weather, Jonathan Zettler, the CCA of the year this year here in Ontario. If you know Jonathan, you see him, shake his hand, give him a congratulations, man. Very, very well deserved. Jonathan just does a super job here for his clients in the province of Ontario, and also lots of times commenting in the Ontario Farmer, that type of thing. All right, let's move on. And oh, yes, it is cold. Oh my gosh, it is so cold. And do we care? Well, if you're in the area that has lots of snow, you don't care. But man, if you are in the area, and there are some areas in the province with almost no snow, what I would consider a skiff of snow. So we know that 1 inch of snow has an R factor, an insulating value of 1. A skiff of snow is significantly less than that. It gets to minus 22. We have winter barley. We're increasing our winter barley acres. Winter barley is not as winter hardy as winter wheat. We have winter canola and we have winter wheat. And all three of those crops become at some risk. So it all depends. Does it drive that cold temperature for the barley and the wheat? Do we get down, and we probably have to get at least to minus 12 or minus 13 on winter barley. With wheat, it's probably minus 15, minus 16 at about 3/4 of an inch or an inch in the ground. And man, it like in some areas, we might get close. With winter canola, it's quite tolerant, but remember, the growing point is at the ground level. So now, do we get through that snow? Do we get to kind of that minus 16, minus 18 right at the crown? And can the winter canola stand that? Yeah, no idea, and there's nothing you can do, so don't worry about it. But it is a real interesting study to pay some attention to. We have looked at winter barley a bit before to see, how much it would stand. And so far, it has been much more resilient than we expected. So has winter canola. but we'll just wait and see. And so if you're in that situation, let me know next spring. I'll be keen to find out, can we take minus 22 with almost no snow and still have an excellent crop? All right, I want to move on and talk about yields, because Agricor is at the GFO meetings and letting growers know how they fared this year. Overall, the provincial average for soybeans at 53.34 bushels per acre. That's incredible. It's 109% of the average farm yield. And what's astounding about that is it's rivaling for a record yield here in the province, but I'd have to look back. It's something like 4 years out of the last 5 that the provincial average has been in that 53 bushel per acre range, plus or minus a wee little bit. And you just go, wowzers. Like, that's quite incredible. And a big range, by the way, so it's not all gravy for everyone. Lambton County at 94%. Why? Because Lambton County just got deluge after deluge after deluge, and you get too much rain, especially on heavy clay. We know what happens. The beans drown out, and then you get lower yields. So not all growers doing well. Meanwhile, the county, so Prince Edward County, taking the prize for the highest percentage over their average farm yield at 132. Now, I am pretty sure that I went out last winter and gave a presentation to the Prince Edward County Soil and Crop Improvement Association, and I am positive that is the reason they're at 132%. I'm being quite facetious. Good for them. Paul Sullivan's stomping ground, Renfrew County, at 131 bushels per acre. Just really amazing. Even Haldimand County, the tough hills, heavy clay, sloping, rolling land of Haldimand County at 126%. Their average yield actually at 53.8. So they're above the provincial average. My good friend John Hussick, who loves to poke fun at me, and I love to poke fun back at him, he must be out dancing in the streets to have that kind of yield. He covers Haldimand County for Agricor. That is very, very impressive. Hey, on the corn front, average yield 198.8. So that's high, but it's not a record. Our record is 202. The real story, and that, by the way, is 110% of the average farm yield. So again, across the province, some excellent corn yields, same kind of deal with ranges, some below, some above. But what I think the story there, or the question there, and Dave Hooker tweeted it out, Dr. Dave, StatsCan's corn number is 180 bushels per acre. Agricor's corn number is 198.8. And you just say, that's a 10% difference in yield. And how we can be that divergent, it really, I don't know what the right number is, but it really does make you scratch your head. We've scratched our heads a lot on that, and I'll just move on from there, but it does make you scratch your head. Okay, I'm going to go back to the Midwestern Ag Conference, because Dr. Scott Shearer from The Ohio State University talking about their eFields program. I love this program, and they do it other places as well, but Ohio State has really put together, I think, one of the best. So they write protocols for growers to look at various projects, and then the growers write scripts, or someone will write a script for the grower. So it's all done in the field, and it's much easier to pull the data out. But Scott showed information that says, okay, these eFields, we are using yield monitors to get this data. And if you're going to use these blocks in the field, in the eFields program, there's so much variability in yield monitors that Scott says the blocks must be 1,000 feet long to make sure that that information is valid. And he showed information where they went uphill with the yield monitor versus downhill with the yield monitor. I've talked about that before. My great friend Nature Nut Nick did a trial once, and the uphill downhill of the yield monitor was a bigger difference than the treatment difference in the field, so the whole thing meant nothing. But Scott showed excellent data that that's a huge impact. Wet versus dry, and just that cushioning effect of the wet on the impact plate. In fact, their data is so sensitive that in the combine, if the sump, so the clean grain elevator throws the clean grain into the combine bin and down into a sump before the bubble auger starts pumping it up into the rest of the bin. If the sump was full versus the sump was empty, that actually changes the yield monitor reading. And so that's why they say they need 1,000 feet long, just to get away from all these variables. They also replicate it in the field a number of times. If you're making decisions based on small blocks in the field, these small learning blocks in the field, this data is really clear. The minimum, the absolute minimum, and is probably not enough, but the absolute minimum is 250 feet. And to get really good data, you need 1,000 feet. And when you're trying to put them in the various yield zones, 1,000 feet gets a bit challenging, but really, really cool information. You want to watch that session? Of course, if you are an Ontario Ag Conference participant, it is up on the web portal, and you can have a look there for yourself. All right, I'm going to move on. I'm going to move to the agronomists from Monday night. So our own Colin Elgie here from the province of Ontario, and Joanna Thiessen-Martens from University of Manitoba. And it really pushes me and reminds me that this critical thinking is so important, and not everything works all the time. So Joanna Thiessen-Martens had some really interesting information. Mark from Napanee asked a great question. He said, okay, is there a cover crop I can grow that will actually release or make phosphorus more available, mine the phosphorus in the soil that is hard to get at? And of course, the conventional wisdom out there, and we've heard it repeated, I can't tell you how many times, that buckwheat mines phosphorus out of the soil and makes it more available. And Joanne said, well, I've looked at buckwheat because I've heard that and I've read that, and I thought, well, man, if that is true, a soil test of 3, a site that they're doing research on with a soil test phosphorus of 3, which is incredibly low. And she thought, all right, let's do a trial with buckwheat. We'll plant buckwheat without any starter phosphorus. We'll plant it with MAP. And she also had a treatment in there with struvite phosphorus, which is known as crystal green. And that was just how the trial shook out. Where she grew the buckwheat without any starter phosphorus, it grew 12 to 18 inches tall and was thin and no canopy, just horrible growth. As soon as she put phosphorus with the buckwheat, whether it was MAP or it was the struvite, the buckwheat grew 4 feet tall, tremendous biomass, just a totally different crop. And Joanne said, if buckwheat really was good at accessing that soil phosphorus, if it really could mine the soil phosphorus, should it not have given more growth than 18 inches? And by the way, if that's all the growth it didn't suck up much phosphorus because it's just no biomass. There's no photosynthate to drive that process, and we didn't get what we expected. And by the way, Joanne also looked at the literature and said there's virtually no replicated trials or data to support that buckwheat releases phosphorus in the soil. Somebody started that concept, and if you say a thing enough times, it actually becomes real in people's minds. I think buckwheat is baloney, and it's so cool to use those critical thinking skills and do the trial and come up with that answer. Here's the other thing that I thought was really, really neat. So I think most of you will have heard at some point Wheat Pete talk about the fact that if you put that phosphorus right with the seed or a 2x2 band with corn, when the root hits that banded phosphorus, it recognizes, or there's something about that band of phosphorus that causes root proliferation, and we get this mass of roots that grows right where the band was, so that we suck up all that phosphorus because the plant needs phosphorus. We've even talked about putting some potash there, because potash doesn't cause that response, doesn't cause the root proliferation, but if the potash is with the phosphorus and the plant gets this mass of roots for the phosphorus, it's also going to get the potash. So it's one of those tricks that we like to use, and it's the reason that banded fertilizer works so well. Yeah, I thought that worked just about across the board. It works with corn, it works with soybeans, works with wheat, works with canola. Guess what? It does not work with flax. And it doesn't work with flax because flax is so mycorrhizal and it has such a good symbiotic relationship with the mycorrhiza that it doesn't seem to respond to that banded phosphorus. And it's not that it doesn't sometimes respond in yield, but you don't get that root proliferation. So just really cool stuff in Wheat Pete's mind. Okay, going to move on and talk about weed control here quickly. A caller calling in saying, "Oh, Pete, where is publication 75, the guide to weed control? I haven't been able to find it. I've asked my agribusiness outlet. They don't have any copies. My old copy from, 2022 or whatever, it's just done, or maybe it's 2018. I forget the last year they actually printed them. Where do I get one?" So talked with Mike Cobra. He's for the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, the weed lead, and he is, of course, the expert on all this stuff. And Mike says, we've really moved to the Crop Protection Hub. And in the Crop Protection Hub now, you can query it about a specific weed or a group of weeds. And by using the efficacy view or the list view, you can actually create your own customized files, and you could print your own book of the stuff that was really important to you and not have all this other stuff in publication 75 that you really didn't use. But he also recognizes that not everybody is willing to curate their own book, if you will. And so Mike is hoping to work on a print resource that he will be able to have available by this spring. I mean, that's a tall order, but if anybody can do it, Mike will. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll be able to tell you that something's available in the future. But right now, the printed copies of Pub 75, they do not exist. The Crop Protection Hub is an amazing resource. Okay, Perry asking, "Okay, Peter, do we not need higher fertility to grow big yields? Like I'm targeting 300 bushel corn, 150 bushel wheat, 90 bushel soybeans. To get there, do I not need higher fertility levels?" And just in terms of we need the research to support that so that we can actually build our fertility levels and have some data to say that that is acceptable. And so, Perry, really interesting, because Dan Quinn and Greg Stewart, Dave Hooker, all talked about this at the Southwest Ag Conference. And when you get to higher yields, what's really interesting is that you get higher nutrient use efficiency. So in particular, you would say, okay, if 200 bushel corn needs 160 pounds of nitrogen, then 300 bushel corn needs 240 pounds of nitrogen. But it does not appear to be that way. It's as if 200 bushel corn basically, at a 0.8 pounds per bushel is 160 pounds of nitrogen. But when we get to 300 bushel corn, it may only need 210 pounds of nitrogen because it grows a bigger root system. It seems to be able to access more of those nutrients, and so it gets improved use efficiency of the nutrients that are there. Now, I don't think anybody's ever going to say that we don't need any additional nitrogen, and that work is still being done, but we don't need as much more as you would think. And I think that's really interesting. I think the same thing is true of phosphorus and potash. As you get a bigger root system, you access more of that soil volume, you can pull more of those nutrients out. I still think there's lots of research that says having medium soil test levels give you higher yield than low soil test levels. You're not going to move me off that bar, but the concept that to get 300 bushel corn or 600 bushel corn, we need very high soil tests. I'm not sure I buy that. I just think that we need enough, but I don't think that we need excessive to get to that particular point. On that, Dwayne from Saskatchewan saying, "Hey, Peter, so phosphorus in the soil, what do we do in terms of how much phosphorus we put in the soil before we go to just replacing what we took off?" And so, Dwayne, the bottom line, in Saskatchewan, you're using the Olsen soil test, the sodium bicarb phosphorus test, same as Manitoba, same as Ontario. In Alberta, they use the Kelowna. But You go to a medium soil test. You build that soil up until you hit medium, and that's where you're actually getting 10 bushel more wheat, 13 bushel more corn, 5 bushel more soybeans out of having that higher base fertility, and that is where we're driving to. And after that, that's when we go to the maintenance strategy. All right, going to finish up here with a comment from Tom around manganese. And by the way, this is awesome because it really shows me. I talked about manganese at the very end of last week's episode, and Tom comes back, and actually several people have come back to say, hey, by the way, on that manganese thing, which is kind of cool because the podcast is over 20 minutes long and people listen right to the end. Anyway, Tom says, Peter, you know our farms. We have sand soil. When we grow wheat on the sandy fields, particularly the sandy knolls, we know that we have to apply manganese on that wheat. The only question is, does it get enough growth in the fall that we need to apply it in the fall, or is it a late planted field that doesn't get that much growth and we apply it in the spring? Sometimes we end up applying it twice. And I said, yeah, Tom, once you've identified those areas of the field, you know you have to hit it. Do you still have to hit it in corn? And Tom said, yes. We don't have plot data. The corn goes manganese deficient, turns lime green. We go out, we spot spray those corn plants. So both corn, soybeans, and wheat in really deficient areas do respond to that manganese. The other really interesting comment from Tom, man, wherever you get that manganese deficiency, you need weed control. We have all sorts of trouble with chickweed, with field violet, with purple dead nettle, and it's always in those manganese deficient areas. So this is where correlation does not equal causation. Do we have that weed pressure because of low manganese? I sort of doubt it. I think we have that weed pressure with those weed species because they do better on the sandy soils. They just are able to tolerate sandy soils better. Plus, my guess is that for a lot of years, the crop competition on those areas was a lot less because it didn't get enough manganese before we figured this out. And with poor crop growth, you don't get crop competition. The weeds go to seed. Now you've got a weed seed bank that you are fighting, and you're still fighting it, and you will win one of these days. And with that, I am out of time. That's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, January the 22nd. Hey, keep the feedback coming. I love it. And I will talk to you again for way too long next week. See you then.